Let's get going then. So we're going to start with 2016, number 2 on First Superior Bank. I will get the whiteboard going here. Okay. All right. So let's look at 2016, number 2. The following is the balance sheet of First Superior Bank. Okay, so on the left, we have reserves and loans. On the right, we have liabilities and equity. As a reminder, every time we look at these, they should balance out. That's why it's called a bank balance sheet. So assets should always equal liabilities. And let's look at it. So the first thing is telling us is to assume that the required reserve ratio is 10%. Like I've said to you before, I personally like to have I like to get information to myself kind of right away, right? So we have 2016, number 2, okay, and it's going to be the First Superior. All right. So again, I like to have information for myself in terms, so we know that the reserve requirement is equal to 10%, right? And then I like to give myself the money multiplier right off the bat. We know that the money multiplier is 1 over the reserve requirement. So in this case, it's 1 over 0.1. So our money multiplier is going to be 10. All right. And that's before I've even done anything. I have this information available for me to kind of answer the questions as they come along. All right. So what is the dollar value of new loans that First Superior Bank can make? This is a question making sure you understand what you're looking at. So if we have $200 in reserves, the required reserve ratio is 10%. So we have demand deposits of $2,000. We have met that reserve requirement, but we also have $1,800 out in loans, which means we don't have any money currently with us to make any additional loans. The answer for this, okay, is that there's nothing to lend, right? The answer is 0. Okay, there's nothing to lend. We're just tapped out. Okay. B, Mr. Smith deposits $100 of cash in a demand deposit account in First Superior Bank. We want to calculate the maximum amount of new loans that First Superior Bank can now make. Okay. All right. So for B, we have to calculate the maximum amount of new loans that First Superior Bank can make. Well, we know that we've got a $100 deposit. So with that $100 deposit, we have to take 10%, okay, for our reserve requirement, which we know is going to give us $90. Okay, so in order to find this answer, we're just going to now take the $90 and multiply it times the money multiplier. And we will get $900. So did I just do too much with this? Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. I'm 1 ahead. For B, we just want to know what the maximum amount of new loans that First Superior Bank can lend out. We have a $100 deposit. We subtract the reserve requirement in this case, which would be $10, which is 10% of the deposit. That gives us $90. First Superior Bank can now make additional loans of $90. Okay, so that is the maximum amount of new loans that First Superior Bank can make, and that is the bank specifically. All right. Now C is going to be what I'm getting into, where I try to get into right now. Okay, so all right. And C1 is asking this. As a result of Mr. Smith's $100 cash deposit, calculate the maximum change over time in each of the following in the banking system. Okay, and this is where my little cheat sheet is going to come into play here. Okay, so we want to know the maximum changes in the banking system over time in these 2 categories. First one is loans, and the second one is demand deposits. For loans, since we know that there is so we want to see the new maximum loans. We know that there is a reserve requirement on each additional deposit from here on out. So in this case, we are going to take the deposit, so it'd be a $100 deposit, subtract $10 because it's the reserve requirement. That gives us $90. Now the bank can take this $90 and make new additional loans with it. So we're now going to multiply that times 10. That's our money multiplier, which means that we'll have $900, okay, in new loans. All right. Now this can get a little kind of confusing and tricky here when we get to 2i. Now 2i is asking for what is the maximum change in demand deposits. This is new additional deposits. For looking at the maximum change in deposits, we do not have to subtract the reserve requirement. This is just going to tell us, okay, well, what is the maximum number of new deposits that we're going to get without taking out the reserve requirement? For this one, it's very simple. This one is just going to be the deposit times the money multiplier. And we're going to get $1,000. Okay. Again, if you have any questions, please just stop as we're going along here. Okay, so D. As a result of Mr. Smith's $100 cash deposit, calculate the maximum change over time in the money supply. Okay, so we want to know, well, what is going to happen to the money supply? Remember, the money supply increases with each additional deposit, and this happens exponentially. So it's going to, we're going to see the exact same function here that we saw for calculating, okay, the new number or the total change in deposits. So we will take the initial deposit times the money multiplier. Oh, nope, I'm sorry, I did that wrong. We're going to take the initial deposit, subtract, okay, the reserve requirement, which is going to give us $90. Then we take the remainder of the deposit times money multiplier, which is 10, and that gives us $900. Okay. Let's look at E. Provide one reason why the actual change in the money supply can be smaller than the maximum change you identified in Part D. Okay, there are a couple different things that you can put for this answer. Okay, one of the ones I like to say is not all banks not all banks are going to run themselves all the way to the maximum of their leverage. So not every bank is looking to just constantly churn profits. So not all of them are going to lend out all of their excess reserves. Some banks are going to hold on to those excess reserves while others will tend to lend. And this is why we can possibly see not the maximum change in the money supply that we calculate. We can see the money supply actually not grow as much or shrink as much as we calculated. Okay. That's it for 2016. Does anybody have any questions? Okay. Let's move on then to 2012, number 2. I think everybody can see this, so I'm just going to leave this up here. So to 2012, number 2, and this one is the Matera Bank. All right. So let's look at it. We know that for the start of this one, all right, looking at our bank balance sheet, okay, we're looking at our assets and liabilities. We have $100,000 in demand deposits, no equity. So that means that our liabilities are equal to $100,000. We have to make sure that our assets are equal to $100,000. We have currently $85,000 out in loans. We have $5,000 in excess reserves, and we have $10,000 in required reserves. We're assuming that Matera Bank is meeting its reserve requirement. Therefore, the first question is going to ask us, well, what is the reserve requirement? We have demand deposits of $100,000, required reserves of $10,000. Our reserve requirement is going to be 10%. Okay, so our reserve requirement is equal to a 10%. With the 10% reserve requirement, we now know that our money multiplier is also going to be 10. I know that's not required of you for this question right here, but it's always something that I like to kind of have available just for me to look at when I kind of need it in a pinch or when I'm further along in the question. B, assume that Lewis withdraws $5,000 in cash from his checking account at Matera Bank. Okay, and so for B, we're going to have three separate questions of what is the impact of his withdrawal. B1 is asking, by how much will Matera Bank's reserves change based on Lewis's withdrawals? The answer is $5,000. Okay, so the answer is going to be, we're going to have a negative, okay, $5,000, or I don't want to say that because that's kind of confusing. We're just going to say that we have a $5,000 withdrawal, okay, from this case. So by how much will Matera Bank's reserves change based on Lewis's withdrawal? $5,000. We have $5,000 currently in excess reserves. So for right now, that $5,000 is going to go to zero. However, the reason why I don't want to write that out is because our demand deposits is also going to change. Our required reserves will change, which means that our excess reserves is going to change as well. Okay. So for this answer, it's just we're going to have a $5,000 change in reserves. Okay. Let's look at C. C is asking, B2. So this was B1. Okay. B2 is asking this, what is the initial effect of the withdrawal on the M1 measure of the money supply? Okay, this is a trick question. It's making sure that you understand what the definition of M1 is in terms of classification of currency. In this case, we are going from a checkable deposit to a cash. We are just going from M1 to M1. So in this case, there is none. There is no change on the M1 measure of the money supply. 3, as a result of the withdrawal, what is the new value of excess reserves on the balance sheet of Matera Bank based on the reserve requirement from Part A? Okay, and the answer for this question is it's $500. Well, how do we get that? Okay, so what I'm going to type out here is going to seem a little weird. We're going from $100,000, okay, to $95,000. In Matera Bank's demand deposits, okay, which means that our required reserves will be equal to $9,500. Our previous required reserves, okay, our previous required reserves were $10,000. So now our new required reserves is $9,500. There's a $500 difference. So our excess reserves would be equal to $500. Okay. C, assume that the next day, John withdraws from Matera Bank an amount that exceeds the bank's excess reserves. Assuming that no loans are called in, how can Matera Bank cover its required reserves? Again, this is just making sure or seeing how much you understand about banking and the banking system. And we've talked about this a little bit. This is where interbank lending and the discount window come in, okay? So if a bank has a withdrawal that exceeds the amount of its reserves, it's going to now have to borrow the difference to meet its requirement. So banks can borrow from each other using the federal funds rate or from the Fed using the discount window. Okay. And that is the answer for C for 2012, number 2. All right. Does anybody have any questions before we move on to the last one? All right. Cool. I'm just going to leave 2012 up there. I'll delete all this stuff. Okay. So now we have 2011, number 3, and this is Sewell Bank, right? Okay, here we go. So assets, liabilities, we have $20,000 in liabilities. When we look at our bank sheet, okay, we have to make sure that we have $20,000 in assets. Okay, we have $2,000 in required reserves, $8,000 in loans. Okay, we have $7,000 in bonds and $3,000 in assets in terms of buildings and fixtures. Okay, we have a balanced bank sheet. Now, for A, based on Sewell's bank. So based on Sewell Bank's balance sheet, calculate the required reserve ratio. Okay, we have $2,000 in required reserves. We have $10,000, okay, in demand deposits. For this one, our reserve requirement is going to be 5%. So A, our reserve requirement is 5%. Okay, if our reserve requirement is going to be 5%, I know, again, back of my head, I like to have this information. I know that my money multiplier is now going to be 1. Okay, over 0.05, and that's going to, oh no, that's not what I did. Sorry, it's 1 over 0.2, which gives us 5. Okay, and the reserve requirement is not 5%, it is 20%. That's really bad. Okay, sorry about that. So our reserve requirement is 20%. Our money multiplier is 5. I mixed those two up when I was looking at my notebook. Apologies. Okay, so our reserve requirement is 20%. And that's 2,000 divided by 10,000. For B, okay, we're looking at B now. Suppose that the Federal Reserve purchases $5,000 worth of bonds from Sewell Bank. What will be the change in the dollar value of each of the following immediately after the purchase? Okay, so if we're looking at our bank balance sheet, we know that immediately after the purchase, our excess reserves will increase by $5,000. Okay, and the reason why we know that is because, well, we currently had $7,000 that we were holding in bonds. Okay, we're going to sell $7,000 worth of bonds to the Fed. The Fed is going to give us cash. We're just converting bonds to cash in this case. So we're going to take $5,000 away from the government securities under assets, and now we're going to shift that to the excess reserves. So our excess reserves is going to change by $5,000. Okay. For 2, where it says demand deposits, well, this is, again, kind of a trick question, all right? And the reason why this is a trick question is because, well, they want to know what's going to happen to the change in demand deposits. And there's nothing. Nothing's going to happen. This is a purchase of bonds from the Fed. This is not a change in terms of a demand deposit. We have not made any loans yet. This is asking for immediately after the purchase. So our demand deposits is going to have no change. Okay, so $0. All right, let's look at C. Okay, calculate the maximum amount that the money supply can change as a result of the $5,000 purchase of bonds by the Federal Reserve. Well, we want to know what is going to happen to the change in the money supply. This is a purchase of bonds. This is not a deposit. There is no reserve requirement, okay, from the bank to take this excess reserves and put some of it into required reserves in terms of getting money from the Fed. It's direct injection. We can loan all of it out. So for this one, pretty simple, okay, for C, we can just take the $5,000 times the money multiplier, which in this case is going to be 5. Okay, and we get a $25,000 increase. All right, so the maximum amount the money supply can change as a result of the $5,000 purchase is it can increase by $25,000. Okay. Now, D, when the Federal Reserve purchases bonds, what will happen to the price of bonds in the open market, and explain. This is a question that's going to call on your ability to remember the relationship between bond prices and, okay, between interest rates. Now, I'm going to walk you through this. I'm going to type out a pretty long response, but I will say this. If we think about this logically, let's look at it. There is a secondary market for bonds. All bonds can be bought and sold on open markets. So if I have a bond, I can now sell that bond before it matures on an open market to any person willing to pay the price. So we know that in this case, we've increased the money supply. If we have increased the money supply, I know that I'm going to shift the money supply to the right, and now my interest rate is going to decrease. Bonds and interest rates have inverse relationships. If the interest rate goes down, the bond price goes up. If the interest rate goes up, bond prices go down. And this is why. Let's say I have a number of previously issued bonds. If the government is purchasing, okay, bonds, then the number of previously issued bonds on the open market reduces. The supply of these bonds in the open market is reduced. That could shift the supply of bonds to the left, and that could actually increase the bond price. If you want to say that, that is a perfectly acceptable explanation. If you want to mention the relationship between bond prices and interest rates, that is also okay, but you need to explain why, okay? And the reason being is this. If I have a bond at 8% interest, and currently interest rates are at 5%, if the Fed increases the money supply and interest rates drop from 5% to 2%, my 8% interest bond now has a ton, okay, of, how do I put this? Like, people really want to buy my bond because now at the end of the bond's maturation period, I'm going to get a greater yield. I'm going to get a much higher yield on my bond than on currently issued bonds. Therefore, my bond, which is previously issued with a higher interest rate, becomes more valuable. Okay, so for this case, if the Fed buys bonds, okay, so I'm not going to re-say all of that. I just typed it all out for you. Okay, that is, either of those is perfectly acceptable in terms of the explanation. All right, that the College Board would accept. The Fed buys bonds, and the number of previously issued bonds on the open market decreases, which increases the price of bonds. Or when the Fed increases the money supply, interest rates decrease, making previously issued bonds with higher interest rates more valuable. Okay. All right. Last thing, okay, is suppose that instead of the purchase of bonds by the Federal Reserve, an individual deposits $5,000 in cash into her checking account. What is the immediate effect of the cash deposit on the M1 measure, okay, of the money supply? The answer to this is there is no immediate effect. Okay, there's no immediate effect. Okay, we're just going from M1 again to M1. This is 4E. Okay? All right, guys. That is it.
Thank you, Mr. McSweeney.
For today, Buddha's, how long has Buddha been in the waiting room?
That's awkward. Can you explain D, like the second part, when the Fed increased the money supply, that just makes the IR go down and makes previous issued ones like more important? So like,
Makes them more valuable, right? So
Okay, yeah.
I'll explain it in a relationship as if you and I are both in the bond market, okay? So Rush, you're going to hold on to a bond. The bond that you previously purchased, its interest rate was at 7%, let's say, all right? And now I am someone who is looking to buy bonds. I want to invest in bonds. You have this previously issued previously issued bond at 7%. And let's say currently interest rates are at about 6%, right? So it's relatively even. However, the Fed enacts a whole bunch of monetary policy and increases the money supply. The new interest rate after the Fed's monetary policy actions is going to go from 6% down to 3%, which means that any bond issued after the Fed's action is going to start at 3% in terms of its yield. So now that 7% bond that you've been holding on to is much more valuable in the eyes of individuals in that open market. So if I'm looking to buy a bond, I would rather have a conversation about buying the bond from you than buying a bond from the bank, because your bond is going to give me 4% more interest when it matures, as opposed to any bond I buy from a bank now. If that makes any sense. I hope that.
Yeah, that was good. That was perfect. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah. Does anybody have any other questions? No? All right, guys, that's it. I've got office hours tomorrow. I posted those. If you have any questions, feel free to hop in and ask. If not, I posted new FRQs for you guys that'll be due on Wednesday, right? Yeah. No, today's Tuesday. Sorry, that'll be due on Thursday. Then I have office hours tomorrow, and then office hours Friday, because we only had class a couple times this week. So that's it. All right. Thanks, guys, for coming.
Thanks.
Appreciate it.
Peace out.
Have a good day. Enjoy the weather. Get outside. You guys just hanging out. All right. See you later.